yoga. Among these 8 limbs, asanas are just one part, that is just one limb. So I will give a quick description of these 8 limbs. And my purpose here is not to give a very pedantic talk, not to give great references of scholarly texts or articles, but to give a gist of what is yoga. And as I see, meditation is the central part of this yoga, not yoga asanas. So I would be focusing on the meditative aspect and also on the cognitive aspect of meditation, that what happens to your brain when we are indulged in meditation, and what is the phenomenology of meditation, how you experience the world, how you experience your own self, and what are the changes in your outlook towards the very purpose of life, and how you address the very fundamental question, the meaning of life or the purpose of life, once you get engaged with meditation. So since I'm a philosopher, I would be incorporating these areas: phenomenology, a little bit of philosophy of mind in context of meditation, as I just said, that what would be the effect of meditation on mind. And I'm also a cognitive scientist, so what are the cognitive changes happening in the mind when you indulge in meditation? And then I would be finally summarizing it, that how, not summarizing, but I would be looking at the implication of yoga philosophy or yoga mind, if we can use the term mind, for dealing with the current pandemic, the corona period. So if I start this talk with the idea of Patanjali Yoga. So in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, the book written by sage Patanjali, talks about 8 limbs. And among these 8 limbs, the first 4 are yam, niyam, asana, and pranayama. Now, these first 2 limbs, the yam and niyam, they are dealing more with the morality or a kind of preparatory ground. So yama discusses about the abstinence, what you shouldn't do, like you shouldn't uh, indulge in violence, and you should not be doing stealing, like these abstinences. Whereas niyam talks about what you should be doing, like you should be speaking truth, you should be kind and all that. And then we come to, after this preparatory ground, when your body is healthy, your mind is prepared, uh, then you go for asanas. You know, various yoga asanas. There are hundreds of asanas. There are, some of them are prominent ones. Hatha Yoga Pradipika describes in detail about these asanas. And then pranayama means controlling your breath, controlling the pran, which means the life force. And this life force, modern times we say it's oxygen in scientific terms, but I think our Indian sages, they, when they talk about prana, it is much more than oxygen. It's not simply oxygen. It's some kind of vital force which is responsible for our consciousness and for the vitality of consciousness. So once, the basic idea is, once you learn to control the breath, then you also learn to control your mind. There is intimate connection, because there is intimate connection between mind and the breath. So that in that way, these 4 limbs, they make a ground for one to enter into meditation. So meditation, now meditation is also divided into 4 parts. Well, this meditation is the term which we use from Western perspective. And meaning of meditation is to concentrate, to focus on something in an intense manner. But the way Patanjali Yoga Sutra talks about the process, about the meditation process, that is just one part of it. That is to concentrate on some object. Finally, you are to reach to the no mind state, which means, just a second. Finally you reach to the state where your mind is not engaged with any object, not engaged with any reactions uh, about the events happened in the past or the events which you expect would be happening in the future. Your mind is at peace with itself. And okay, I'll come systematically one by one. So the fifth limb is pratyahara, sixth is dharana, seventh is dhyan, and eighth is samadhi. Now, this eighth samadhi is the final culmination of this whole meditative process. I'll describe one by one. Pratyahara means withdrawing of attention from the outside world or from the senses. Now, this is to be understood that normally we remain engaged with the world. And that is important as well for the survival purpose. Because if you are sitting in a passive manner and some enemy is coming in your vicinity, in your room with a weapon, obviously you have to be alarmed before he reaches your neck with his weapon. So you have to take actions, the remedial action, before he actually makes harm to you. And we have to understand that if we believe in the Darwinian theory that we are descendants of monkeys and our ancestors, they were living in jungles, we were living in a hostile environment, in a prey and predator relationship, where either we get hunted up by other wild animals or we used to hunt animals. So we were living in this kind of hostile environment. Then our senses were our best ally, which gives us information about the environment, which is to be hunted and how to uh, avoid your predator. So that is something very natural, that we pay attention to the world through our senses, through our sensory data. Yoga talks about going beyond this natural tendency, as I understand it. So it talks about withdrawing the senses which are worldly oriented normally towards your inner, towards your inner self. So pratyahar means, ahar means with the food which we take, and prati here means against. So you are developing an attitude against the ahar or the food of senses. So in that way, you are withdrawing attention from the sensory data, which is giving us, which is sustaining our orientation towards the outer world. It's a process which is reverse of this our natural tendency. Then the seventh step is dharana. So dharana informs us to focus our attention on an object. Now, this object can be anything, your breath. The simplest object is your breath. And it could be an image, it could be a mantra, it could be some uh, deity in your mind. When your mind is trying to focus itself on this one object, this is called dharana. So आप धारण कर रहे हैं कि मैं इस ऑब्जेक्ट के ऊपर अपना ध्यान केंद्रित करूं. Then dhyana. Now, dhyana is also similar, but here your concentration becomes more focused on some very specific aspect of the object which you have been already focusing on. And the idea is to maintain a sustained attention for a long period of time. And when you engage yourself with an object, forgetting all other objects in the world, all other entities or persons or situations in the world, when you're focusing one thing intently without interruption, I believe this is what my reading is. At that time, you reach to the state of witness consciousness. This is the state of pure self. You experience yourself without any awareness of other objects. Now, normally what happens when we are doing some action, like I'm delivering this talk, or if I'm writing something, I have a consciousness which is always aware, but this consciousness is aware of the object that, okay, I'm giving this talk. If you ask me, what are you doing? I will say, I'm giving a talk. If I ask you, what are you doing? You will say, I'm listening to this talk. So there's a self and there's an object with which self is engaged. Now, in this state of dhyana, a stage comes after immense, intense concentration of you with some object, one single object, forgetting the whole of universe. You are engaged with one single object, and then a state comes, a state of existence comes when you don't even engage with the object. You are in pure consciousness. You are with pure self. And in that state, what we say is witness consciousness is achieved. What is this witness consciousness? It's also called Sakshi Bhav. What is this Sakshi Bhav? Sakshi Bhav or witness consciousness is that state when you are not engaged with the world anymore. You are detached from it. You are untouched by the world. Whether you are encountering a sinner or a saint, a small kid or a lady or a gent, whether they are cursing you or they are praising you, you get to a detached state. You are only witnessing it. It's something like as if you are a judge in a court and you are not engaged with the issues which you are encountering. You are just listening to them or watching them in a third person account, right? In that state, you attain the state of objectivity. This is something very important. Normally, now we have an existential therapist, Amy Dozen. She says, normally in our routine life, when we observe others, when we observe behavior of others, we are very objective. We say this person is very bad, this person is having good intelligence, this person but having jealousy, or this person is very angry, and so on. We are very objectively interpreting people. But when it comes to our own self, we are very subjective. We tend to defend ourselves that I did this anger because this was a valid reason, and so on. So we are subjective with ourselves and objective with others. And she prescribes the reverse should be the case, which means we should be empathizing with the other person. We should be understanding the subjectivity of the other person, what the other is experiencing, and we should be more objective with our own self. Now, this is very important. We should be objective with our own self, with our own experiences. This is very hard to achieve, very hard to achieve. And meditation helps you. In the state of dhyana, it helps you because at that state, you are detached even from your own self. You are looking at yourself from a third person account, third person perspective, as if you have another head from your head and it is looking at your whole life that okay, this Navneet Chopra is doing this action. So that solves a lot of problem in our life, because many times we are wrong, but we justify ourselves, we rationalize ourselves. And in that objective stance attained by meditation, when we find that okay, there is some element of mistake from my side as well, then obviously we make peace with our so-called enemies. And also, this is the state which gives you courage to face your adversaries or the difficult situations. Life is never a rosy road. Life is full of struggles. And nowadays, a very bad attitude has been prevalent among the youth, which they under which they believe that life is to be enjoyed. I'm not against enjoyment, but I want to give you a bigger picture that life is to attain happiness, and happiness is not to be equated with pleasures alone. I repeat, life is for happiness, but happiness shouldn't be confused with pleasures alone. I'm not against pleasures, but I want you to see beyond pleasures. Sometimes, which is pleasurable in the short term, uh, you get addicted to it, then you want more and more of it, and you get a very negative attitude that if you are not getting pleasures in here and now or in for today, then your life is miserable. No, to attain something good, for example, to attain mastery in your subject, you have to go through a painful process of learning. Learning is often not very interesting. Learning often involves understanding complex ideas, doing hard work, sitting, giving a long sitting, concentrated of concentrated efforts. It requires a lot of struggle. It's not an easy thing to do. So the one who is focused merely in pleasures, and usually they are sensory pleasures, he or she doesn't develop the attitude of doing hard work or the struggling effort, and that person will not attain higher purposes in life. He or she will not attain higher knowledge, will not attain higher, even if you are worldly, if you are seeking worldly pleasures, high post, high social post, say an IS officer, he will not get even that. So this attitude of uh, thinking of pleasures as happiness is something limited attitude. I'm not against pleasures, but I am in the favor of looking at the bigger picture and controlling pleasures at times. Not always you are to negate the pleasures, but at times you have to control yourself to stop the pleasure and to develop the attitude of doing hard work so as to attain higher goals. That is something quite well known as well. But I want to emphasize that this ability you gain through meditation. So when you are in witness consciousness, when you are untouched um, by 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 even pleasures or hardships, then only then you can do your work diligently and can attain happiness in the long run. Then eighth step is samadhi, which is the final stage where even the very experience of self is also transcended, where the perfect union happens between the subject and the object and even the thinking process. Like if I am playing football, I am the subject, and the football or the whole play, that is my object. But if I am too absorbed into the game, and then a stage may come, if I'm an expert player, then a stage may come that I'm so merged with this play that I forget my own self. I lose myself in that game. Uh, I'm equating it with a very mundane example like playing football in a very intense manner. But samadhi in Patanjali Yoga Sutra is much more than that. It is merging of the consciousness in the universal consciousness. We don't need to talk about God in a straightaway manner, but there is some universal consciousness, or uh, at least if we assume so, and we need not buy these metaphysical concepts like God or universal consciousness, but this is what the theory prescribes, and I would suggest you not to buy it blindly, but only accept it if if it comes in your own experience, and that would be the authentic learning, a genuine learning. Otherwise, like a parrot, if we are uttering few words, that is absurd, that is useless. So samadhi is the final stage, metaphorically speaking, when the drop merges with the ocean and becomes the ocean itself. So when the drop becomes the ocean itself, that is symbolizing that the individual consciousness is merging with some supernatural universal consciousness, and in that process it is losing itself. There is no existence anymore of individual Navneet. He is no more there to experience even peace or bliss or whatever it is. He is now merged with the ocean, the universal consciousness. So that is the stage of samadhi, the final stage. So if I talk about the relevance of all of these metaphysical views, I would be saying life is essentially a suffering, and this is what Patanjali also talks about. He talks about five kinds of kaleshas, or the dukkhas, something similar to what Buddha has also done. And among these kaleshas, in one simple aphorism, he summarizes, first of all, how he says, avidya, asmita, rag, dvesh, abhinivesh, kalesha. He's talking about five kalesha here. Kalesha, or the uh, afflictions. These are called five afflictions. So, what are these? Avidya is lack of knowledge or lack of wisdom or ignorance, simply speaking. Then Asmita is your ego, your sense of I-ness. And Rag is attachment to the pleasure and aversion to the pain. And Dvesh is obviously to have hatred feelings towards others. And Abhinivesha means will to live or fear of death. So clinging to the life despite of suffering or so many uh, ailments in the body when you reach old age, you still want to live. There is something fundamental uh, will inside us that we want to live no matter what, and we fear death. This is also a klesh, an affliction of mind. It means a yatna or a uh, vedana of the life. So obviously we don't want them. And interestingly, if I see from Western philosophy perspective, there are parallels in Western philosophy as well for almost all of these kinds of kaleshas or afflictions. But I think we need not go there. So we want to go beyond it, and for that we need to be involved in the sadhana. And if we look at Patanjali Yoga Sutra, this book, the first sutra or aphorism, it talks about, okay, that from here starts the process of yoga. And the second aphorism talks about yogash chitta vritti nirodha, which means yoga is cessation of modifications of mind. What does it mean? Actually, this second aphorism, this second sutra is containing the whole essence of the whole book, the whole talk, which we are involved in right now. It's yog, which means union. Union is the cessation of modifications of our mental states. Our mind is uh, like honeybee is constantly shifting, constantly moving from one state to the other state, one thought to the other thought, one emotion or feeling to the other ones, and we don't have a stable mind, and we get attached to many worldly things, as I just talked about, the five kleshas, which involves rag and dvesh. I consider these two as the fundamental one. Fear of death is something very fundamental. I think that shouldn't be touched upon straight away. But rag, dvesh, actually none of them is easy to denounce or easy to go away. We have attachment to pleasures, as I described a few minutes ago in detail, that modern youth has developed an attitude of pleasures all the time. So we are attached to the pleasures and we don't want to have pain even for a single second of time. But sometimes bearing that pain is good for you to attain higher purposes, to attain competence, and so on, and so so the happiness in the long run. And we have sense of ego and ahankar with us, that I am the greatest, I am the most important person in the whole of universe, which is the greatest impediment in learning and greatest reason for the conflict in life with the whole of world, with others, because everyone is trying to prove himself the greatest over the others. So obviously they are in conflict with each other. All of us are. So yoga is a method to go away from these uh, kaleshas or these afflictions. Just a second. So the final goal is cessation of these variations of the mind or modifications or the movements of the mind or chitta. But if you cannot attain that final goal of cessation, at least we should aim for restraining the mind's modifications or movements, or we should aim for quietening these modifications or stilling these modifications. So once we attain a still mind, that is that can be said to be the goal of yoga. And interestingly, now if I draw a little parallel with other systems, other meditative systems across the globe. So in Japan, they talk about Zen meditation. So the same goal is stated there, that when you attain Zen mind, which means no mind, which means stable mind, a still mind. So when you are in stillness, when your mind is still, then you are in a very peculiar brain state as it is measured by modern sophisticated instruments like EEG. So they talk about four kinds of brain waves: alpha wave, beta wave, gamma, and theta wave. When you are in waking condition, we are alert, but we are also stressed. So that corresponds with the beta. And when you are very lazy state, then it's theta. And when you are in deep sleep, it's I think gamma state. Oh, sorry, delta state. Okay. So the lesser your alertness is, lesser frequency of these brain waves are observed. And if you are alert, then the frequency becomes higher. But at the same time, with alertness, you are also under stress. And that stress is not something which we want. But interestingly, in meditation, when you are that is a state which is called as relaxed alertness. So that is a state where you are maximally alert, but at the same time you are maximally relaxed. So in Japan, they use what in our terminology we will say they use karma yoga. I will come to karma yoga as well in a while. So karma yoga is nothing but engaging with the action at hand with full devotion, not thinking of the fruits, not thinking of any external benefit from it. So when you are in that meditative state through action, through karma, it's karma yoga, simply stated. And Japan or this China, these countries who are more eastern than us, they have focused very religiously on these activities and have attained meditation from the action. Interestingly, I would say, and we know they do win most of the medals in Olympics and Asian Games. But in our system, when we are talking about Patanjali Yoga Sutra, that is a still meditation. We are not doing action. We are in Patanjali Sutra, which is also called Patanjali Yoga, is also called Raj Yoga. We are sitting still and we are trying to attain finally the state of Samadhi. So the goal is to have a still mind or cessation of mind or quietening of mind. And that is called sthita pragya. And that is, once it is attained, then you get the benefits. Even when you have not attained the stage of samadhi, which is the final stage, before that, you attain many benefits, as I discussed already. Am I running short of time? Yeah, how much time I'm left with?
So 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, okay. I would also like to have a discussion. I mean, it shouldn't be a monologue only. And whatever I have spoken based on that, if you give me feedback and we can discuss the ideas, that will be better.
The floor is open to question answer round. Please put in your questions in the chat box.
Just a second. I have a few more things to say.
Okay, sir.
Yeah. Okay, so I was talking about that how it works. So put it in short, the mechanism of meditation for how it acts on the brain. That is also very well documented nowadays scientifically, particularly in cognitive science. I also want to make it a point that meditation or Patanjali Yoga Sutra need not be taken with a religious spirit, like need not be associated with a particular religion, like Hindu religion. It can be taken up like an exercise of the mind. Like just like you go to gym and you do dumbbells or other exercises for building muscles. Similarly, you can take it as an exercise to build up a better mind, a still mind, as I told earlier. So cognitive scientists like in University of Wisconsin in America, there's a psychologist, Richard Davidson. He has done extensive work on the meditators. He asks them, requests them to go in meditation, and then he puts their brain into the scanner. There are some fMRI machines or PET scans or other kinds of scans, and he looks at that what kind of changes, like in EEG brain waves or other kind of changes in the brain are happening when they are in meditation. And they have there's a beautiful paper. I would like you guys in future maybe to study it in detail by Holzel et al. In 2011 it was published, and it talks about 5 ways in which meditation affects the brain. So first way is attention regulation. Like normally our attention keeps on shifting, it doesn't stays long on an object, but meditation enhances your span of attention. Then body awareness, obviously it becomes much more vivid, that you feel your experience of body to be much more And then there's emotion regulation. This is something very important. Most of the problems of our life are because we fail to regulate our emotions of anger or fear or jealousy. So when you learn to regulate your emotion through meditation, it's a great achievement. In meditation, what we do, we watch at our negative emotion in a non-judgmental manner, and we accept that negative emotion. Suppose I am having anger or I'm having fear of someone. Instead of running away from this emotion inside me, I should, when I'm in meditation, I should watch it. I should accept, yes, it is there. And then I non-judgmentally, when accept it, I often go beyond it. Similarly, it also helps in exposure, extinction, and reconciliation, which means once you expose yourself to something which you fear, and over a period of time, you become habituated to it. So it no longer gives you the same kind of fear which earlier it was giving you. So these are the ways in which we know cognitively meditation helps us. So there is a solid scientific evidence for the efficacy of meditation as well. It is not to be associated with just one Hindu religion's uh, tool to make people religious or like that kind of allegations which are often put on. Now, finally, I'm coming to the final concluding part of this paper, that how to deal with the Corona period. In that context, look, we have to understand little phenomenology which describes our structure of experience, how we experience ourselves and the world. So it informs us that there are some three structures of our existential being. This is Mythwelt, Umwelt, and Eigenwelt. Now, this Eigenwelt is purely our personal world, that what are my experiences, how I feel. But Mythwelt is our shared intersubjective world with others. Like I'm in relationship with others, and how others treat me, how they respond to me, that governs that how my world with others is structured. This is called Mythwelt. And then there is Umwelt, which means how my physical world around me is there, surrounding me. So, and what is my relation with that physical world? So, if I'm living in a noisy city or whether I'm living in a peaceful village, so that has an impact. So that kind of effect we're talking about. Now, normally we have all of these three words, and that gives us richness in our world and in our experience of ourselves, for which we are habituated. But because of restrictions in Corona period, our Mythwelt, our world with others, is significantly hampered, significantly constrained. And also our Umwelt, the physical world, is also significantly constrained. We are not allowed to go out to the malls, to the movie theaters and marketplace. So naturally, this results in a very constraint in our existential structure, and we don't feel well. But interestingly, meditation is a tool to give a transformation to your inner self, in which you may develop something called authentic self. Now, normally you are always other oriented, you are always seeking attention of others, you want to belong to others, you want to interact with others, and that interaction is hampered or restrained. But when you develop an intimate relationship with your own self through meditation, then this dependence on other is removed. If not completely, at least significantly it's removed. And that in that way you can easily tolerate this Corona pandemic period. And normally, if you don't channelize your orientation of consciousness towards inside, I said earlier that it is by default in by default mode, our consciousness is other oriented. If somehow you turn it inside, then you can remain comfortably with yourself. And it's not only to deal with corona period for a temporary period, but it is also develop something authentic self, the self which is unperturbed by the vices of social world. So just few lines. We know great philosophers since ancient period, like Socrates, he raised certain questions that how should you live, and Kant raised question that what can one know, what should one know, what can one hope for, and the question what it is to be a human being. My answer to this last question at least is that what it is to be a human being is to be answered that to be a human being is to be a reflective being. If you don't reflect, then you never improve. Then you are just like a stone. We know stones remain as stones as they are, and they can be subjected to any kind of external force. It has no choice, it has no agency, it has no freedom. But to be human being means we shouldn't live like a stone. We should reflect and we should evolve. But this kind of attitude requires a kind of introversion. Introversion means when you are inner oriented. As Socrates says, know thyself. But that inquiry never arises because we normally are very much other oriented or outside world oriented. Meditation changes this attitude or this orientation, and it makes us self aware or introverted in a positive sense. So this is how you can help yourself through meditation. And to repeat, it is not just some affiliation with a religious sect for which we need to promote yoga. And yoga is not to be identified merely with yoga asanas. It is a combination of all. Mainly, we say it's combination of. I mean, broadly, we can say combination of yoga asana, and before that, pranayam and pranayam, yoga asana, and dhyan. So, in that way, if we adopt yoga in this sense, some people say that asanas and pranayama are merely exercises to keep your body healthy, which is partially true in my belief. But it makes a preparatory ground for our mind and body to focus on dhyan or the meditation, and maybe the final spiritual goal of samadhi one day we will attain. But even before that, while living this life, we want peace. We want to be away from suffering, and we want to make optimal use of our consciousness and our energy to attain higher goals in life. Or all of these goals, meditation is required. And I believe this should be a mandatory part, just like PT in schools, like doing some physical exercises. It should be mandatory in the school system itself. And philosophy should also be a mandatory subject for everyone, actually. It shouldn't be an optional course. It should be a mandatory course, because it orients your consciousness towards these questions, which can, reflecting upon which, can evolve you and can make you great. And in that way we can make our nation great. So for a happy, harmonious life and harmony in long run, and for attaining greatness, I think yoga should be adopted, and along with philosophy, it should be a mandatory part of our education system. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you, sir, for your enlightening words. Your words truly inspired us and have given us a fresh new perspective to look at the world. We have truly understood the true meaning and essence of yoga and learned how important and essential yoga is and how we can apply it in our daily lives. Thank you, sir. Now we'll have the question answer session.
Yeah.
I request everyone to put their questions in the chat box. So the first question we have is from Nidhi Singh. She is asking that can we practice pranayama to cure sinus?
Look, these are all questions with which I'm primarily not concerned because they are dealing with body only. Baba Ramdev would be an expert to deal with these questions. Uh, I don't know. I don't know about this particular. Yeah, you can move to the next question.
The next question is by Swati Nayak. What is the ideal daily routine and lifestyle for students like us according to yoga philosophy?
Okay. A second. Sorry to interrupt. But I think I shouldn't be sound very disheartening even for the very first question. Let me tell you, I myself practice pranayama and yogasana intermittently. I'm not very regular, but I have started developing a beginning stage of asthma. It's not because of corona. Just before corona, I developed it somehow because of pollution of Delhi, I guess. And I do pranayama. Uh, it's kind of pranayama what I do because it's controlling of breath in a specific manner, and it does help me in my this beginning stage of asthma without medication. I don't take medicine, and still I get much relief. So I believe the pranayama might help you even in sinus. It should be helping you, but uh, I don't want to give a concluding answer to that question. Okay, the second question, please, can you repeat?
The second question is by Swati Nayak. What is the ideal daily routine and lifestyle for students like us according to yoga philosophy?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Ideal routine. देखिए, one thing is that you do pranayam and yogasana because it has direct impact on bodily system, and also on hormone system. Our mind and body are intertwined. Actually, they are not two different things. So when your bodily hormone system and your neurotransmitters, which they which get affected by pranayama and yogasana, when they are good, then automatically that means your mind is good. So you should do them. Yes, it doesn't take much time. For example, just take Surya Namaskar. You can do Surya Namaskar at least 3 times within 5 minutes, and you should do it along with controlling the breath. This is one thing. And at the end of the day, when you are going to sleep, I think you should give 15 minutes for meditation. And by meditation, I will prescribe very simple meditation of focusing on your breath. You're sitting, you should sit straight, keeping your neck and spine in one single line. Your head, neck, and spine should be straight in one single line. Close your eyes and just focus on the breath from your nostrils, which are coming and going. I would prescribe no mantra, no deity, nothing, no thinking, just focusing on your breath. So that is dharana. And one thing I want to say that pratyahar, the withdrawing of attention, though they have said as the sixth limb, I believe it is not possible unless you develop the ability to focus on some single object. Anyhow, so you do meditation at least for 10 or 15 minutes before going to sleep, and after that you spend 10 or 15 minutes in writing a diary in which you will reflect that how was your day, what were your experiences, and you do it in a very honest manner, in a very objective manner. If you find yourself at mistake in today's events, you do acknowledge it and write it so that you may bring some changes. So this is what my prescription would be. सुबह आप ध्यान की सुबह आप वो कीजिए प्राणायाम and yogasana, and if possible also meditation. But रात को at at night you must do meditation and write a diary. So for 15 minutes, so you should spend half an hour before going to sleep in this practice. That I believe would bring a lot of change in your life, because when you reflect after meditation, you are in a calm and objective mood, in an honest mood. And then when you reflect and right? It may bring profound changes in your life. That's it.
The next question is by Gati Kochar. She's asking, Sir, I, being a philosophy student, can totally resonate with your talk. Would you like to recommend some books on this?
Books on meditation or in general, uh, the student is asking about.
She's asking about the topic that you have explained right now.
Okay. Okay. For that matter, I would recommend Jiddu Krishnamurti. J. Krishnamurti should be read, the books by him. And also his talks on YouTube. And interestingly, when he is asked about meditation, he denies. But he himself has gone through rigorous practice of meditation and has gone through certain experiences, maybe the stage of samadhi as well. And is a very normal person, very ordinary person in shirt and pant, no orange clothes, nothing, no fuss. But probably he is an enlightened man. He has probably reached to that state of samadhi. You get glimpses of it when you read, for example, his biography by Pupul Jayankar. Pupul Jayankar is the lady, the author of his biography. Forgetting the name, but you will find it on Google. So with meditation, people have great expectation that suddenly you become enlightened or you will attain the state of no mind. I think this is also one of the questions. This is a very subtle and controversial actually aspect in my understanding. When you are focused on attaining the state of no mind, right? This is also a thought. When your goal is to attain the mind having no thoughts, this in itself is a thought. So it's a kind of self-contradictory. And when you are very keen to attain this state of no thoughts or enlightenment or God, whatever, you are not at ease. You're not relaxed. And meditation goal is to reach at that no mind state, which means not having any attachment. Not having attachment, not merely with worldly objects, but also with any kind of ideology, including the very ideology that I should have nirvana or I should have moksha or all that. So this is very paradoxical. You start with this goal in the life and then you get stuck in it. So your mind is never relaxed because you are too keen, you are too strongly holding on to reach at the state of absolute bliss or whatever you call it. So the trick, as I have, it's my personal understanding, is that okay, you go to meditation without having much expectation. Go with a very easy expectation that okay, I'm quietening my mind. Maybe my attention will be increased, concentration will be increased, and it will never be is cessation of mind. But if it can be minimal mind, even that is to be appreciated. And when you will go, you will find that even focusing on the breath is not easy. You have to spend many weeks when your mind will start becoming focusing on the breath. First step. Then the next step is you focus on your body, on your thoughts, emotions, which are coming up again and again, and some negative emotions. You accept them. You just watch them, don't act on them, but you watch them. And gradually you will accept them and gradually they will die off. So maybe someday after months or years, you will reach to the minimal state of mind. I won't say it is zero mind, but minimal state of mind, in which you have some bubbles of thought coming up and then destroying on their own. So enjoy that state. Don't hold on very strongly to reach at the goal of enlightenment or no thought state of mind. So because this itself is a thought. Whenever you say I don't want to have any thought, this itself is a thought. So you cannot help it. Let it come and go. It will come and it will go. So take a little casual approach towards meditation, and then whatever will happen, let it happen in its own way. sometimes you start making projections. This is also a trick. If you focus too much on a deity, I'm usually against using an image of a deity or a mantra, especially deity, because if you are totally focused on a deity, then there's a risk, there's a danger that your mind is projecting deity. Some people report that I one day in meditation saw the Sakshat Durga Ma in front of me, or Sakshat Shivji in front of me. I think this might be a case of just projection of your mind. So the safe bet is to focus on your breath, and after that, keep on watching your emotions, thoughts, images. They come like ripples and then they go, because nothing stays there forever. They have to go. You just don't participate in that. Just watch it and it will go. So that should be the way.
The next question is by Shipra Dubi. She's asking, what are the most important yoga scriptures that she can study in leisure time?
Patanjali Yoga Sutra obviously is the one, and then Swami Vivekananda has also written books on Raj Yoga. There are four kinds of yoga he talks about: Karma Yoga, Gyan Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Raj Yoga, and he's prescribed that uh, in combination of all four, or three out of them, or two out of them, or one out of them, you can choose according to your mental disposition. If you are not very intelligent kind of person, then you can choose Bhakti Yoga. If you can go through Gyan, which requires intellect, then okay, obviously Gyan Yoga. And Karma Yoga is to do the things in dispassionate manner. More detail maybe we can discuss in some other talk. But when you are intensely engaged with something without seeking the fruits of it, it's a meditation, and then you may have all kinds of benefits. But I've been asked about the books, so Vivekananda's books are good on it, I believe, and there's the Pradipika, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and also by Shankaracharya. I think there are some good books. That's it.
Since we are out of time, so we'll be ending the question answer session here. Thank you, sir.
Okay,
And
so yeah, please.
yes, so if they have any more questions, we will be sharing your social media links with them so they can connect with you.
Yeah, I'm always available for discussions, so you can share my email address, if not phone number. So if there will be some questions, and if I find that the questioner is a genuine questioner, I mean, there should be a dent in your life after reading something. It shouldn't be just for the sake of an exam or for the sake of a certificate. That is a very bad reason to pursue something. So for a genuine questioner or genuine seeker means someone who take it to the heart and want to uh, make a change in his or her life. So for these kind of inquirers or seekers, I'm already always available. Yeah, well. From Akriti, okay, let me read it. Someone is asking an interesting question. Is it normal to get headache while meditation, right? Akriti Singh is asking.
Yes, sir.
I think sometimes it is normal, because your sanskaras are coming up on the surface, and probably your brain goes in a mode of restructuring itself. uh, I experience it myself as well. My brain becomes very hard. It is something like rebooting the computer. I suspect so. So my brain, when I do meditation, I have been a meditator as well, and so when your mind, like my brain becomes hard, for a few minutes it remains hard, and then it sometimes it goes to sleep. Then I go to sleep. Sometimes it doesn't go to sleep. It becomes then relaxed. So you keep on doing meditation, and I repeat, I prescribe doing meditation by focusing on the breath. Simple. No mantra, no fuss, no deity. That is my prescription. But you are free, obviously. Yeah, there are a few more questions. Someone is saying in meditation his mind gets distracted every time. It's okay, mind will get distracted, that is its nature. Just keep on doing. Whenever you find yourself distracted, then you come back to your object of concentration, the breath, right? Best time of doing yoga is morning and before going to sleep. By yoga I mean meditation, but otherwise for pranayama and asana, morning is better. Some people do it on evening as well. That's all I think.
Thank you, sir. Now I'll be delivering the vote of thanks. Honorable Principal Ma'am, respected program officers, our most valued speaker, and all of the participants. It's my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. I, on behalf of National Service Scheme and National Cadet Corps, extend a very hearty vote of thanks to our honorable speaker for taking out time out of his busy schedule and gracing our event and sharing with us his findings and opinions today. A big thank you for your efforts, sir, towards our theme for today's session, the essence of yoga, yoga in daily life. Sir taught us the essence of yoga and meditation. He took us through 8 steps. We learned to be subjective and objective and how to manage our behavior and improve our attitude of thinking. He helped us understand our problems and find a way to solve them. We learned to understand and control our mind. We are all inspired by your great words, sir. I also extend my thanks to our respected principal ma'am for giving us this opportunity and for her enormous cooperation in the organization of this event. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to the program officers of National Service Scheme and National Cadet Corps for the perfect logistic support and guidance they've extended to all of us. An event like this cannot happen overnight. The wheels start rolling weeks ago. It requires planning and a bird's eye for details. We have been fortunate enough to be backed by a strong NSS and NCC team of very motivated and dedicated students. I cannot thank everyone enough for their involvement and their willingness to take on the completion of tasks beyond their comfort zones. Lastly, I would like to thank the audience for remaining patient and listening to the entire session so enthusiastically. Once again, I want to state that we are all most grateful to Honorable Dr. Navneet Chopra. We thank you for being with us this evening. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
I request all the participants to make sure that they have filled the attendance sheet, the link for which is provided in the chat box.
Also, this is to inform all the participants that on the weekends, that is Saturday and Sunday, we'll have 20 minutes of yoga followed by 20 minutes of meditation and then 20 minutes of journaling in the morning at 5:45 a.m. It is not compulsory to join, but if you are interested, you can message Sagrika and she'll provide you the link. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.